What is your greatest act of love? And by that, I want you to think about what did it cost you to express that kind of love? When I think of my greatest acts of love or the acts of love that I've been able to witness or be a part of, it's interesting that I also think of loss. Several years ago, my grandmother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And I can remember the day that we were called to the hospital to say our goodbyes. They were planning on transferring her home on hospice, but the doctors didn't think that she would make it. So they wanted us to come, say goodbye just in case. As it turns out, she made it home, and she made it for a couple months after she got home. And I got to witness a lot of my family sacrifice what was their normal life to begin to take care of her. They helped her live out her dying wish of being at home when she died. There were a lot of sacrifices that everybody made to make sure that she felt loved in those final 2 months of her life. This past summer, my grandfather died just a few weeks after learning that a cancer he thought was removed from his body had spread and to a point that it was too late to do anything about. He died very early in the morning, but I got to spend the evening before he died with him, and he asked me if I would say a prayer for him. And I said, yeah, I would be more than happy to pray with you, but I want to know how you want me to pray. And his response, I don't think I'll ever forget. He said, Sean, Papa's ready to go. Ask God to let me come home. And as I sat next to him, praying through tears, I asked that God would heal him by allowing him to die. I didn't want to pray that prayer myself. Selfishly, I wanted him to stay. I wanted him to be here. But I knew that he wanted to go and be with the Father in heaven. And so I prayed that prayer, and it was sacrificial. It cost, but I did it because I loved him. See, the ultimate cost of love is sacrifice. And we've spent the past couple weeks at Hannes Creek talking about this idea of the cost of love and the sacrifice that is often associated with love. And we've looked at it from two different perspectives. So the first week, we looked at it from the perspective of Mary anointing the feet of Jesus at Bethany. And then last week, we looked at it from the perspective of Judas and what Judas loved. Mary cracked open that alabaster vessel, and she poured that expensive perfume worth a year's wages on Jesus' feet. She used her hair to wipe it off of his feet. That day, Mary sacrificed two things. She sacrificed the security that possessions can sometimes bring, and she also sacrificed her reputation to display the love that she had for Jesus. And then we looked at Judas' perspective, and Judas loved his own perspective on life so much that it seems like he sacrificed eternal peace. Judas simply could not see Jesus the way that Jesus wanted to be seen. And so Judas attempted to manipulate the situation in a way that he felt was best, and the end result for Judas was definitely inner turmoil. And that inner turmoil was ultimately too great for him to overcome. These two perspectives, these two responses that we see in Mary and Judas really present us with the choice that we have in our own lives. And that question is like, how are we going to respond to Jesus? Or maybe the better question is, how are we going to respond to Jesus' love? Jesus teaches us a lot about love. He teaches us a lot about the cost associated with love, at least if we choose to love the way that he loved. In John chapter 15, verse 13, John records these words of Jesus talking about love. He says, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends." Now, the interesting thing is that this is a part of Jesus' teaching just before he's arrested to eventually be crucified. And John kind of paints this picture that Jesus is teaching about love, and then he goes on to describe that Jesus demonstrates the exact love that he was teaching about. Jesus willingly laid down his life for all of us. So what does true love cost? It cost Jesus his life. Jesus is the living example of God's love for humanity. The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, that God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So I want to pause for just a moment and think about the cross as the cost of Jesus' love for us. In our world today, the cross has kind of become this fashion symbol. People proudly wear a cross around their neck. Those die-hard Christians wear those crosses all over their t-shirts. You walk into any Christian building, you'll find a cross on the wall, and sometimes it's a plain cross, sometimes it's an elaborate cross, and we display these things as if it's something we're extremely proud of. But the cross at Jesus' time was a far cry from being a fashionable symbol. The old hymn, The Old Rugged Cross, rightly calls it the emblem of suffering and shame. The whole design and the procedure used to crucify a person was meant to bring the most amount of excruciating pain possible and the most exposing death possible to any individual. Those crucified were often beaten beyond recognition before being forced to carry the crossbeam of their own cross to the place of their own crucifixion. Once they arrived at the crucifixion site, they'd be nailed or secured to that crossbeam by their hands. That crossbeam would be hoisted up onto the vertical beam. When it landed in place, the feet would be attached to the vertical beam. And most often, people that were crucified died by asphyxiation. The individual simply couldn't breathe well by hanging from the wrist, and so they would push up with their feet on the nail just to try to grasp for breath, only to fall again and feel the excruciating pain from the nails through their wrists. This is the kind of death that Jesus died because he loves us. Now, the thing that I think we have to be careful of in our faith is to see Jesus' death as like God's plan B. The death of Jesus was not a reaction to the fall of humanity in the garden. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 through 20 tells us that Jesus was chosen to die before the world was created. Peter wrote this, "For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake." God's eternal plan was to come in human form on behalf of the very people who turned their back on him, to die for them, to express his love for them. When I think of Good Friday and the cross, I think of God's declaration at his work of creation. Anytime we read through the works of creation, we see God ending by saying, "It was good." And I've always struggled with the idea that we call this Good Friday. Why don't we call this Black Friday? It's a very costly day. But the reality is, it's a Good Friday because the death of Jesus, the cost of love, is good because it's God's work on our behalf. I can imagine that God probably stood off in heaven, seeing Jesus dying on the cross and saying, "It is good." So knowing what love costs leaves us with a choice. Will we love Jesus the way that Mary loved him? Will we forsake our possessions? Will we forsake our reputation? Or will we continue to love our own perspective on life so much that we run the risk of forfeiting eternal peace like Judas? I wanted to come to you this Good Friday to paint a picture for you of the ultimate cost of love. It's a cost that none of us really have ever experienced. But Jesus was willing to pay the price. He gave his life for you and for me. And we can only love because he first loved us. Happy Good Friday.